Welcome to the Voices Less Heard podcast. And for my guest today, for a long time, I've always wondered what it takes for people to work within the early childhood development field. Having been in the field myself for the past 15 years, I always wondered how people had the staying power. How do you stay in a sector, perhaps that is one of the most underpaid sectors, yet highly consequential and highly influential in the lives of young children? And so today I speak with Professor Alan Pence, former professor at the University of Victoria in Canada. And Alan Pence's professional work with children and youth began around the 70s as a teacher at an alternative inner city high school in the US. And during that time, he was concerned that the high school was perhaps too late to have a maximally positive impact on children's development. And so he then stepped into the early childhood development space to begin to provide some leadership. And during the 70s, Pence, provided direct support to 2 to 4 year olds, establishing a high school based early childhood development center, as well as a student parenting program, providing training for a five county rural area that included migrants and First Nation programs in Canada. He has over the years had profound research background, working at the University of Victoria in Canada, as well as working around the world in different contexts. Professor Pence, or Prof Pence as I call him, is the recipient of the Canadian Bureau for International Education's Award for Educational Leadership, University of Victoria's inaugural Craig Darroch Research Award for Societal Contributions, as well as being the principal planner and founder of the Early Childhood Virtual University. He was also shortlisted as a finalist for the internationally prestigious WISE Award for Innovation in Education. Prof. Pence continues, even in retirement, to mentor, teach, and support leaders like myself when working within the child development space. So tune in, listen to this interesting conversation that I've had with Professor Pence. Prof, for joining us for this conversation. And I, like many others, have really been intrigued by your journey, particularly in the early childhood development space and the work that you have done over the past 50 years. And in fact, I think it's 25 years of those 50 you spent primarily focused on Africa. And so just to start us off, this work, comes on the background of so many conversations, particularly where folks talk about, women being, the lead, and women taking a lot of, lead when it comes to working within the early childhood development space. Can you speak to us about who was your mentor or who mentored you? How did you get into this work right from the very beginning?
Yeah, and that really takes me back to my first years in early childhood, which started as a frontline caregiver in 1971. And one of my first mentors was Prof. Bronfenbrenner at Cornell University, and his publications related to his book, which was The Ecology of Human Development. And I still remember the first time I read an article of his related to his subsequent book.
Yeah.
It was during my first year in early childhood work, while I was also working on my master's degree at that point as well, and it had a focus on cross-cultural development. I was concerned that much of the child development literature did not resonate for me. Those children and what the researchers chose to focus on did not sound like my children and my parents. I didn't know where the problem lay, but Uri gave me guidance. Both through his approach to understanding child development using an ecological lens and through this quote, "Laboratory research observations too often lead to the science of the strange behavior of children in strange situations for the briefest possible periods of time." I love to read that. I still remember sitting in the library and thinking, this guy gets it. That's why my kids and my families don't look like what the literature is describing, because they're in a lab and What I am is in a child care center. I see the parents, I see the
Yeah.
kids, I
Yeah.
see a good part of their day.
Yeah.
And that to me, that was a real aha moment. And he became a hero of mine from then on. He actually did the introduction to the first book that I ever edited. Yuri provided the introduction. So I identify him as probably my first early childhood mentor.
That sounds so interesting. And you mentioned him as your first early childhood mentor. Were there any other mentors as you started off in the journey?
Well, another one that I came across later that helped me at a somewhat later point in my work is an article written by Thomas Weisner and Ronald Gallimore. It is entitled "My Brother's Keeper: Child and Sibling Caretaking." And this, I think, is where it's kind of advantage that in my master's degree, I was looking very broadly at cross-cultural anthropological literature and the rest. It wasn't a narrow early ECD, program. It was quite broad. I came across it in their analysis. They were describing work. They collected data from 186 societies, chosen for their relatively detailed ethnographic material on children.
Yeah.
The article raises questions that have been troubling me about the dominant child discourse literature, virtually all of it coming from the global north.
Yeah.
Weisner and Gallimore note that there has been, in quotes, there has been a nearly exclusive focus on maternal caretaking and to a limited extent paternal, to the exclusion of non-parental caretakers, e.g. adult kin of the parents, non-kin adults, and a variety of children, particularly siblings. And I know that resonates for you as well, Patrick, in some of the conversations that we've had. But that 186 Societies research indicated was that in the post-infancy, early childhood years, virtually none. They were saying 0% of those society had mothers as the principal caregiver, with 19% principally the mother, but others have important roles. So the article goes on to note that the majority of children in that age group, that young age group, are actually cared for by other children. Hence the title of this article, My Brother's Keeper. And that statement tends to make many of those in North America wince. And they kind of start to reach for the child protection phone number saying, you've got this 5-year-old watching a 4-year-old over there. I think they should come over. But for me, it raised the question as to what degree does research coming out of the global north provide us with information about children's lives globally and the complexities that exist globally?
So that's really interesting, Prof. And thank you for that. I mean, when I think of, childcare and I think of, how I was raised, right, I resonate so much with this notion that children can be caregivers to other children, right? I remember I grew up in a large family. In fact, there were 17 of us. And by the age of 5, I knew I was taking care of my younger siblings. I knew that I had to make sure that they've eaten, even though I was a baby myself then. I also had to make sure that my younger siblings had also had access to food, and that they, basically were taken care of. And in it, I think of the research that, the late Barnabas Othala did, in terms of child-to-child care in Namibia, in Botswana as well. And so really does attest to what you're saying there. But here in the global north, if an 8-year-old is looking after a 4-year-old, the phone is going to be picked up by a neighbor to say, hey, there's a problem.
Exactly. And as you're saying, with Barnabas Otala's work and the child-to-child work, this is an example, I think, of some of the research that was very useful and creative. That's hard to find now. You still, it's part of the Sankofa issue, if you will. And but it was almost a quarter century later that I really began to find much. There have always been some, like myself and others that I would read, coming more of the cross-cultural literature or the anthropological literature that would reference this sort of thing. But it wasn't strong in the mainstream child development or early childhood literature until I think it was, 2008, I came across something that Jeffrey Arnett had
Sure.
written.
So before we, I want to talk about Jeffrey Arnett a little bit later, but let's go back back into the 70s. Go back into the late 70s. You took your first trip out to Kenya, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about your experience there. Yeah.
Yeah. So in 1977, I'd been working in the field of early childhood for 6-7 years at that point in time, and for various reasons, I just I wanted to take a break. I actually wanted to see if early childhood was still what I wanted to do, just that work. And took a break away. And what I found myself gravitating towards was wondering about the early childhood work that was being done, because I could see their early childhood programs, I'd see the kids, etc. And so I managed to track down, his Kenya Institute of Education was taking a lead at that point in play, at that time. Margaret Kabiru was working there at that point. So I met Margaret going back actually 1977.
Oh, wow.
And there were a couple of Kenyan researchers doing work there as well. But Margaret opened some doors for me to take a look at the kind of policy development, training development, regional things that were happening. Many of them following on the post-independence and the Harambee movement. Let's all pull together.
Let's all pull together, yep.
And the early childhood programs in Kenya could trace their lineage back into that early post-colonial independence period. And I actually traveled up near the lake, up to near Kisumu, and went to one of the training programs that was being held up there. I spent a couple of days. And I was very impressed actually with the level of coordination, the level of complexity that was being engaged with through the leadership of early childhood at that point in time. And anyway, I that became the first article that I ever published. I purposely wanted to publish it in Young Children, which is the NAEYC journal.
Yep.
And I wanted to be provocative. The title is Child Care in Two Developing Countries, Kenya and the United States. So what I was referencing there was my 6-7 years of working in early childhood, at that point in the States rather than in Canada, and seeing many of the limitations that exist and continue to exist. Really,
sure. So it was more now looking at what child development in context, right? So you've had this experience in Kenya, and now you're trying to juxtapose that with the American context.
Yeah, it was my opportunity to take a look at what other countries were doing. My experience base up till then, up until 77, had been in the U.S. I knew that system quite well. I'd done Head Start training. I'd done 4C coordination. I knew those systems, and I knew the weaknesses that they had. So being in Kenya, again, I wanted to, what is childcare like in Kenya? And I was impressed. It's not to say that it was perfect, and it wasn't what I could read about going on in, say, the Scandinavian countries or certain parts of Europe that were well advanced over what was going on in the U.S. at that point in time. But there were things that were superior, and it was, again, part of the missing critique that the North doesn't apply to itself. It works on this assumption that we know West is best, that kind of thing. And when you get right down to it, what I was seeing in Kenya, in a number of instances, was that this is actually better. This is as good, or this is better, or this is innovative, or they're really doing something good here about involving local communities and local leadership and stuff like that. So that was around
the time that you started your doctoral studies. Is that correct?
So that's about the time I started the doctoral studies and completed that. Then back in the States. And it was shortly after that I then my wife living in Canada then moved to Canada. And completed my dissertation. And and that transition actually exposed me to another facet of early childhood in North America, which was my wife was she was the money earner. She had the job. And so I was going to be the child caregiver, which I figured, I can do this. I've been doing it for 7 years type of thing in child care. And so I was the house father. But what I wasn't prepared for was taking care of my baby daughter at that point in time. And it's kind of a lonely place to be. I hadn't quite realized that personally, that degree. In a childcare center, you've always got other staff. You've got people around.
True.
You've got other adults. But here you are, you're in your 30 and she's 3 or 2, that kind of thing. So the conversation is a little limited in certain respects.
It's limited,
A lot to do. But anyway, so I went to a Moms and Tots program. And I thought, okay, well, this is where I can find like-minded people. But one woman took me aside a little while after I'd been in and said, you do know this is a Moms and Tots program.
not dads and tots.
Well, there weren't any Pops and Tots programs we had. And so that was one of the other early childhood experiences that I didn't understand it until I got into it. And then you begin to see it at the ground level and what it looks like and that sort of thing.
That's fascinating.
So I did complete then my dissertation and have given thought to the idea of being in childcare. So obviously, being a man in childcare for 50 odd years, it does come to mind. And also the house fathering, how that fits into that as being a very different experience than being a male childcare provider. In that. Quite all that.
That's interesting, and part of the things that I found interesting about your journey and the work that you've done is how you quickly shifted, right? As you are learning all of these things, you go to Kenya, you come back, you write this sort of paper that you submit to this reputable journal. But what I also find interesting is that you continued the learning journey, right? And you then got an invitation from the tribal council. Was that correct? Now for you to immerse into a different cultural context. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So that was, I'd been at the University of Victoria here in British Columbia then for about 8-9 years, something like that. And had been doing I'd been applying Bronfenbrenner's ecological work. Our first studies that we did, we were adopting an ecological approach, looking at children in different kinds, not just in center-based, but in family daycare and in unlicensed family daycare, and interviewing not just the staff, but the parents. And we also interviewed the children, which was nothing. It was something you didn't find very often at that point. So we were trying to get as close to ecological as we could. But then out of the blue, and I think some people were aware of that ecological interest that I had, because I got a call out of the blue from quite a large tribal council in northern Saskatchewan. One I hadn't heard of it before, is the executive director, Indigenous fellow. He said, I'd like to come and talk to you about an issue that we have here with our early childhood programs here on reserve, term used in Canada. And I said, well, I'd be happy to meet with you, but the program, the school of child care that I'm in, doesn't have any early childhood Indigenous program training or anything. He said, well, I still want to come. And he did. And a very impressive individual, very charismatic when he came in to see me. And I think I was only 5 minutes into that. And he said, we have some issues that we want addressed, and we think you can help us with those. It has to do with, we don't feel the training we're getting for our caregivers is really supportive of context and culture. Okay, so
that's interesting.
He had me right then. It didn't matter.
Wow. Yeah.
Context and culture, that's what had been a motivator for me throughout my career. And this is 15, 18 years on. So he really didn't have to say anything else. I had no idea where this was going, how we were going to do it. But his personal energy and commitment and clarity was, okay, I'm not being asked to drive the car. I'm just being asked to come in here and help on the post-secondary, trying to get that in alignment.
So just to clarify the Prof, so his concern then was, what our students or what our people are being taught is not reflective of our way of life and our culture. So can you come and help us?
That's the way I understood it. After he left and I ran it through my mind, it was really, I felt he was asking our curriculum, what of us is in here? And so he provided that curriculum to me, and it was pretty much the standard college level education, training, and the rest of it. But
Mm-hmm.
there was really nothing about their communities or their traditions or their values or anything
So it was
else.
more driven by, what would you say, Western values,
Yeah,
Eurocentric
it's
sort of
very
value?
much based on a Western, this is what it like developmentally appropriate, DAP, DAP.
Okay. Yeah.
It's like that sort of, this is the way you do it. Science says this is the right way.
Yeah.
And, fortunately, Bronfenbrenner had made me a little distrustful of some of the science going way back to the beginning, saying
Mm-hmm.
it's coming from a certain place. You have to appreciate that place.
Yeah.
And that curriculum, it wasn't bad. It wasn't necessarily even wrong, except in that context, it had nothing about the context. So it was problematic. And that, basically is the enduring feeling I have, is that, we have some good ideas from the North, the Western approach, et cetera, but it's not the full story. The long and the short of that one was that I ended up working with that community, that tribal council, 7 different communities. In there, we came up with a different approach to post-secondary education, which is called a generative curriculum.
Yeah.
And the generative curriculum was based that you've got 2 different key facets that need to come into this. You've got the Western part, and again, there's elements there that are useful, and you've got the community, and the 2 need to interact. It's not like one's wrong, one's right. We're going to throw out the
So
other
it's not
one.
an either or, it's a both and, right?
It's a both and, exactly. That's what you need. You need to put it together, and the students are the ones who really need to gain, what is the both and that makes sense? What do we think will work in our communities? And the other key part is that, the Western prof coming in, myself coming in, that I don't have that information, but individuals in the communities do. The knowledge carriers that the community needs to decide who they are, they become co-instructors. So it wasn't me in the classroom, but it was people we're hiring locally that were not from the community, and they needed to work alongside and to have an ongoing discussion, about this is what we hear here. What makes sense in our communities? What can we use? What should we change? What do we need to bring in? So it's a very interactive curriculum, and it's a curriculum that's not pre-formed. Most curriculum is pre-formed.
Sure,
You follow it. It's written down. On day 2, you do this. Day 5, you do that. That wasn't
this was, learning by discovery, almost, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, and
That was that accepted though by the university? Was that an accepted path? Knowing universities
have a whole other that's a whole other long story in there. So there were certain things. What I wanted to do was to stay true to the partnership.
Okay.
The Meadow Lake the tribal council had identified what the issue was. I agreed with them.
Okay.
Next step is that, can we do things differently, and will it work out better? So I didn't say, and we would use the titles of the courses would be the same ones that we had.
It's the ones at the university.
Development, it'd be programming, it'd be et cetera.
Sure.
The difference was when you came into the classroom, what you saw was an interaction. Rather than a knowledge transfer, is a knowledge engagement and generation of knowledge there. So I didn't tell the university really what I was doing until we had external evaluation data that came in.
Sure.
And it quite frankly blew us away. The typical completion rate for the early childhood and other Indigenous on delivery programs in community was less than 50%, sometimes 40, 35, 25% completion. We had 85%.
Oh, wow. 85% completion.
I had to look at that. It didn't take hard to collect it because we have X number starting and we have X number completing. But I was impressed. And the reason and we had an external evaluator who was an elder actually came in.
Okay.
And what she said really had another big impact on me. She was saying that I know this community. I'm not from it. I know it. I've seen it in the past. And what I see is a different community here. The community has changed, and they are seeing knowledge within their community as being important.
Wow.
They are proud of that.
Yeah.
And the students are being are being lifted up, and the elders are being lifted up by this interaction.
Wow, that's really, I mean, it warms my heart to hear that, because many times one can view education as this is the knowledge keeper and they're going to share it out. But, I love hearing these stories about transformation, that the whole community was transformed, not by what they didn't know, but by the process that they unpacked what they knew and shared it with others.
Right. And her final statement was that, what you asked me to evaluate, was the program successful. I can tell you that in one word: yes.
Wow.
But now let me tell you about what really matters, is that we have people who feel differently about themselves, not just the students, but the elders and the others, because this was a community involving, community supporting, community elevating experience. And these communities, I see them they see themselves differently. I see them seeing themselves differently. That's not me. That's an elder saying that.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. So far, as you talk about this, I pick three things, right? So the first experience that you had, obviously, as your was the first, as a caregiver to your own children, right? And then the journey that you took to Africa as another transformative sort of piece in your life. The third one being this work with this Middle Lake Tribal Council here in Canada. So with these three things informing your praxis, how then did you decide to move forward? What did you then decide to do going forth?
Well, the opportunity arose then. The work with the First Nations communities, it ultimately involved 10 different tribal councils throughout Western Canada. So it wasn't limited to this one. And I think every one of those had external evaluations. And the data coming out of that was remarkably similar, 80, 85%, that type of thing. One of the communities said, well, we don't really have any knowledge keepers here in the community. I said, well, this is a 2-battery program. It can't run on one battery. It can't run on the Western battery alone. It's got to have the community battery. So let us know when you've got some knowledge keepers within there. 3 months went by, 6 months went by. 9th month, they said, well, we have found, Auntie Mary and Auntie June, they've been delivering babies in community long time here.
Wow.
They don't have academic degrees. They don't have bachelor's or master's or doctorates, but they have a lot of experience. Is that okay? And I said, well, that's not only okay, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Right? And so by this time, because we had the data supporting it, the evidence base that this works effectively, it really is something I can begin to share with my university, that they began to appreciate that we had expanded our entourage of knowledge holders. It wasn't just about the Western North ideas. This was a collaboration with the communities and stuff like that. Yeah. So anyway, then we continued that. But then UNICEF in New York, the head of early childhood education for UNICEF, heard about this.
Okay.
And his name is Cyril Delay. That was back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And Cyril reached out to me and said, I've heard some interesting things about what you're doing. There were First Nation. I'd like to come out. I'd like to know more, etc. And he did come out. He was a part of a summer institute that we're running in 1994.
And that's at the University of Victoria.
At the University of Victoria. We held that. He came out. And so we focused largely on our First Nations work. So he really got, with our students coming in, the rest of it, he really got immersed in what this was about. And when he was ready to go, he said, I think this is something we need to try in the majority world more broadly. And over time, then that invitation from UNICEF, from Cyril, Africa became the primary focus. And that led into the, areas that you're very familiar with and experienced yourself, the Early Childhood Development Virtual University, which wasn't focused on frontline undergrads. It was focused on graduate level leaders who the country identified as being key. So, I mean, there's so much learning that came out of this First Nations work about.
So let me just pause you there, because there's a question that I've actually never asked you in my interactions with you. why did you and Cyril choose to have a focus on graduate level people that are doing the work as opposed to training those that will come up and do the work? Why was that important to UNICEF, and why was that important to you as well?
It was certainly important to me because there was no way that my university could reach out to all of the, I mean, the vision for Africa was not about, we're going to focus on Malawi, we're going to focus on Tanzania. The first seminars that I did with Cyril, with UNICEF, they would identify who are the key people in, and we'd have about 12 different countries coming in.
Okay.
And these were people that UNICEF had identified as being key, in terms of early childhood.
So they were part of their strategy, the UNICEF strategy for Africa at that time.
Yeah, and so some of the times they would be inviting in people who are university profs or college or NGOs or INGOs or policy people in government. So from the very, very first seminars that UNICEF provided funding for, where we'd have 35 people for 3 weeks, they were a real mix.
Yeah.
And it wasn't accidental. We wanted that mix because part of what I had seen going country to country was that you could have great innovative things happening on a policy, a training, et cetera level, and country X sitting right beside country Y. And there was no knowledge of that, across it. There was a sound barrier, sort of a communication barrier there. And so bringing these people together from these 12 different countries, 35, et cetera, the power of people working in similar locations, in policy, in education, in local, et cetera, hearing from others, from 10 other countries, that became a key, very powerful part of the learning.
Yeah.
What they were taking away included things I would bring into it, as an outside prof, or others like Judith, or other key individuals, and from within Africa. But so much of what was happening, just like it had been with the students back in the
tribal council in MTC,
the power and the energy was in the interaction.
Yeah. Wow.
And what we've got are people who are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly knowledgeable, really know their country and how it works, and they could share their stories with country X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, and then you really begin to, you move into levels of learning that are simply impossible in a knowledge transfer approach. You just can't get there.
Yeah, because I mean, the narrative that have always been there, right, is the other approach, which is we know best. So it's sometimes they say the West knows best, right? And so the West takes the knowledge down to Cameroon, to Kenya, to Namibia, or to Zimbabwe, for example. And I really love just this aspect of co-construction as well as co-instruction. So did you bring in, within the early childhood virtual university, as it was called, did you bring in, tutors or instructors from Africa? And in what capacity were they coming in?
Yeah, we did two different things. From the very first time out, we had 2 profs who were African and about 5 who weren't, but they were people who had worked in Africa and were, considered, they were very top-notch international. And then we also had our face-to-face. A lot of this was online. And the face-to-face, wherever we went, whichever country we went into, we would invite in lead individuals from that country. So they would be a part of the face-to-face over the 2 to 3 weeks. And then by the time we'd gone through our 3rd or 4th delivery, the majority of the profs were, people that, like Bame, Kofi, Joe, these were key individuals from within. So the intent there was then and then over time, students who had taken the course in the first delivery or 2, they became profs at their universities, and they became instructors in the ECDVU. The whole thing was always about how can we best promote capacity in Africa but not doing so through this very limited, very weak knowledge transfer, top down, north to south way. How do we do this? How do we reach out and get this bubbling action? And the intent with each one of the students coming from each country is they needed to be doing exactly the same thing in their country. They needed to be connecting with the instructors, with the policy people, with the NGOs, and bringing them all together to engage in this. So we were basically modeling an approach to greater learning and greater relevance and greater contextualization through doing it ourselves. That was the model.
Yeah, that was an interesting model, and it's so fascinating to see. For me, even if I go back perhaps 9 years ago, to see that some of the graduates or the alumni of the program itself were now going into, or were in at the time I joined the program, were either ministers in their own capacity, or were heading ministries, or were policymakers, and so you really, and I see the strategy why then you went for the graduates and not the undergrads. You really wanted people that would influence policy and influence how funds or finances would be allocated to early childhood development.
And we wanted them to create those programs living in Africa. We wanted them to start. So there's no way that the ECDVU could reach out to the hundreds of thousands of frontline childcare workers, but there was a way on working on a pyramid basis that we that trickle through where so many, one of our deliveries, it was predominantly instructors at teacher training colleges for early childhood. And so we had the 20 of them in the cohort, but they were reaching thousands.
The impact was then and still is today from the different alumni that I know. I know some teaching at universities in Tanzania, in Malawi, in Uganda, across the continent. There are various alumni from the Early Childhood Development Virtual University that are doing amazing work and generating and co-constructing knowledge along with the communities in which they serve. That remains very, very impressive.
Well, the University of Ibadan is continuing to deliver the ECDVU there for Nigeria.
In Nigeria.
But I appreciate what you're saying here very much.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. So part of the thing that I was reflecting on this week as I was thinking and preparing for this podcast is to then think about your work in the context of looking back, right? So you get to this stage in your career where you say, hey, I've poured my heart out, I've put in my time in terms of serving not only the children and communities in Canada, but in Africa as well as around the world. It takes me to this publication, Sankofa, Appreciating the Past in Planning the Future of Early Childhood Education, Care and Development in Africa. Can you just speak to me a little bit? I know, about the background, perhaps for our audience here. Just, take us back. What conceived or conceptualized this publication for you?
Well, in a way, I suppose my very first lesson that could lead to Sankofa was the experience back in the 70s of going to Kenya and seeing such real richness there. Existing in Africa. There was the first conference in 1999, and the title was Showcasing What's Happening in Africa again. So, and what was concerning to me was that too many of the people that I was working with back in the 90s were no longer with us. And I knew, it's like the adage, it's like the library is lost. Each time you lose one of these people who have been so central, who have been so creative, so influential and important. It's like burning a library. And so if you haven't got copies of what they had, then how can you learn? How can you benefit? How can you carry that? And so the word Sankofa was a natural. It's like we need to know what has happened before, so we better inform what we're doing going forward. The Akan term. And so I think my own experience in seeing how rich it was in these various pockets, across all parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and losing people that I considered to be my mentors in terms of work in Africa. Cyril Delay, his death. And Cyril and I'm sorry about this in a way, because Cyril and I had talked about it. He said, we need to do this.
Yeah.
And then he died. And so part of it, I guess, is a homage to, Cyril in terms of this needs to happen. There are great things that have happened in Africa all along and that are happening now. And people need to know that, because it's not as though the future can't learn something from the past. It has an enormous amount to learn. We've lost our thinking. It's a very kind of Western way of the future is. It has to be new. We have to start, all of that. We don't, bury the past. Let's go forward.
Yeah.
I mean, there's elements to that are important to know, but there are many, many elements that are saying, no, let's make sure we actually understand what happened before.
True.
And so Sankofa, to me, I mean, it's obviously a very personal project, as it is for you, editor, because we know these pages, we know these people, we know this, and we do deeply believe that others can be helped through hearing this, just like I was helped from hearing Yuri Bronfenbrenner, that the strange behavior of strange situations. I needed to hear that. I needed that.
Yeah.
And to hear it coming from authority from him.
Yeah. And so just for our listeners here, Sankofa really is a term from the Akan people in Ghana that, when translated, really speaks into this notion of one should remember the past in order to make progress in the future. And again, part of it too is that, what you speak to, Prof, being able to make progress in the future is knowing the past and where we're coming from. And you've spoken about, the passing of Cyril Dale and the knowledge that he had. Of course, I think of, Barnabas Otala, I think of Bamin Samenang. I think of, all these people that had such depth of knowledge. And in it, also allow me to say that part of the work that my generation does is also standing on the, shoulders of giants, right? And so you are one such giant that we, whose shoulders we stand on, and so is Cyril and Bame as well. When you think of Sankofa, the book itself, what impact do you think it will have going forward in terms of just informing child development in context? Do you think that is a volume that, generations down they'll be able to reflect on and use and say, oh, aha, I see what was going on in 1979 and how we are stuck because we haven't moved from this, or how we are able to move because now we know this? Do you think that this volume, this book, would be able to be influential in the future?
I certainly hope that it can be. And I think that what it's saying is relevant, not just for Africa, but Southeast Asia has its stories, it has its history, it has its giants and leaders and key events and activities. All parts of the world have their stories that need to be told and learned. I think what was very formative for me was Meadow Lake laying that out in front of me, that we are us. And we have history. We have ways of doing things. And our education needs to incorporate not just only our stuff, but many things, but it definitely has to include us in that. And Sankofa is a testimony, from my perspective, to a place with the many us's. As you know, 34 authors, 85% are African citizens. This is not a outsider looking in type of this. Every author there has put in a lot of time there, and the majority are Africans themselves. And I hope that we get many Sankofas from other parts of the world, because for me personally, moving into this place that I've loved being in as an academic, it's a place of learning, because you have all of these other ideas and perspectives and contexts and cultures coming in. It's the most again, I think it's the greatest learning spot to be in, where you're hearing what else makes sense, what else. We're so deprived when we're looking only at the 5%, as Arnett would say, the 5% telling the other 95%. Okay, fine. I don't. I can handle the 5%, but I really want to know about the 95%. So that's the work that lies before all of us going forward.
That's true, and I like the fact that this book, this Sankofa book, is just not telling you about the history and going back, just on the history of child development in Africa, but it's something that is applicable globally too. And so for our listeners here, we invite you to, go on Amazon, get a copy of the book. It's called Sankofa, Sankofa, Appreciating the Past in Planning the Future of Early Childhood Education, Care and Development in Africa. You'll find it to be a very informative book that will help you as well to develop, wider, knowledge on a whole range of child developmental issues in Africa.
Well, thank you very much,
Prof.
Patrick. Thank you for
now,
this
Prof,
opportunity.
I won't gonna, every time I sit down with elders, I always try and catch, lots of strays of wisdom, and you've been sharing a lot. And so now that you are retired and you look and you see, we're living in a poly-crisis, there are so many wars that are going on around the world. The economy, when I think of, just, here in Canada, or I used to think of Victoria and British Columbia and think of Canada, the economy is just imploding. My generation is barely able to make ends meet, in more ways than one. And so as you look at all of this now, as someone who's retired, how has the perception and understanding of the importance of early care and education, in your view, how has it changed over time, and what has influenced these changes?
Yeah, it's probably the basis for a whole other discussion that we could have roaming out, and It would be an interesting one, I think, and I suppose you'll get into this as you do other interviews, and kind of hearing that.
Yeah.
I guess for me personally, I feel that there has been, that history basically has a lot to teach us. And Sankofa is in part a history, but it's not simply a history.
Okay.
It's sociology, it's child development, so many other things.
Yeah.
But I remember first time, one of the questions I had when I was doing my doctoral work, was I'd been in the field for 7-8 years. And the question in my mind is, why hasn't the United States done more to address early childhood education, care, and development? So my first history study was going back and looking at that. And what I came across was back in the 1830s, there was a presidential election, and DeWitt Clinton, who had been the governor of New York State, was running for president on the basis of we need infant schools.
Okay.
He's talking about preschool programs. So then the question is, why had no other presidents or presidential aspirant put that on the agenda for the next 150 years, basically, going on?
Yeah.
So there's things we learn by going back into these spaces that do help us better understand what we might do going forward. And that discovering that statement, that there were things such as infant schools back in the 1820s, 1830s in North America, was an absolute eye-opener for me. I couldn't believe that had happened. So when I look back, I see places where in North America we've done things better for children. It's complex. I mean, you can't just take one period and say, well, they were doing this then, why not now? It is complex.
True.
But there are bright spots back there that help us to appreciate that more can be done, and there's different ways of looking at it instead of just this next step, continuum. You need to go sideways as well, back in history, sideways. Look at what other countries are doing. Look at what you used to do. Look at what you could do. I guess that'd be the major thing I would say. I would hope that we are closer to the point that we will look in many, many different directions, not just the one that's saying, this is the road, get on it, this is the way to do it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Professor Alan Pence, Prof Emeritus from the University of Victoria, right here in British Columbia. Thank you so much for your immense, contributions to the field of, child development, over 50 years. Working in Africa, working in North America, teaching, educating, co-constructing knowledge. We really appreciate you, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing this knowledge on this podcast today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Patrick.
Thank you for listening to the Voices Listed podcast with Dr. P. Mac. I hope you enjoyed insights that came out of this conversation. Keep your notifications on. Our next episode will be dropping soon. Thank you and enjoy.